I'm Leo Casey. I was a vice president of the UFT until last September. However, they're not letting me go. They're holding on to me for various sorts of things. Maybe they're holding out for ransom from Randy. And I am now executive director of the Shanker Institute in DC. And the Shanker Institute is a policy and think tank arm of the AFT, which was charged with doing work in the three areas of focus in Shanker's professional life, that is public education, unionism, and democracy promotion. And so as part of that charge, we are doing a project which is to prepare lesson plans that we can publish in various venues to aid teachers in teaching the 1963 March on Washington. So we've recruited a group of teachers in New York, most of you who are sitting out there in the audience now. And in aid of you doing this well, we are putting on two different sessions. This is the first one. This session will be a conversation with people who were actually involved in the 1963 March on Washington and people who knew Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph well. The object of tonight's session is for you to hold a conversation with them and learn more about their experiences and what they drew from them. The second session, which is, I guess, 3 weeks from tonight, will be a session where we bring in historians that have studied and written about the March on Washington and Bayard's life and A. Philip Randolph's life. And there will be a chance to have that conversation with them. Are we okay? All right. All right. So what I'd like to do is we will come to the people up here in a minute, but for their so that they know who they're speaking to, if we just go around the room and people identify yourself by your name and if you're a teacher, where you're teaching, and so that there's just some general appreciation.
Maybe the level you're teaching at too might be useful.
Okay, why don't we start here?
My name is Phil Whiteman. I'm a science teacher in middle school at John D. Wells. It's in Williamsburg, Brooklyn.
Shauna Bourdin. I'm a Title I math intervention teacher, 1-8 division in non-public schools. We service different schools.
And I'm Anthony Harmon. I'm the Director for Community and Parent Engagement here at the UFT. Formerly a high school teacher here in Manhattan.
Jeannie?
I'm Eugenia Kemble. Used to work with the Shakers.
I'm Gene Glaberman, a retired graphic designer, and I was around when Al started his account and for many years.
I'm George Altamari, one of the founding officers of the UFT, and now the professional committees of the UFT.
I'm Brenda Schuftel. I'm an elementary school librarian at PSA in Harlem.
I'm Sofia Ponte, 5th grade special education teacher at PSA in the Bronx.
How you doing? My name is Azim DeVoe. I teach high school mathematics, and I'm the UFT chapter leader at the Academy of History and Citizenship for Young Men. It's located at the high school campus in the Bronx.
My name is Steve Lazar. I teach high school history and English at Harvest Collegiate High School. I'm also a chapter leader there.
I'm Anthony Green. I'm a history teacher at the Wadley Secondary School, Performing and Visual Arts in Harlem.
Jose Wilson at ICD2 Middle School, teach 8th grade math. And yeah, anyway, I keep forgetting all these things. So sorry.
You can introduce yourself, Shannon.
I'm Shannon Ashley. I'm Leo's daughter. I'm a college student here at the
I'm Camille Edie. I'm a chapter leader. I'm also a math coach at PS 81 in Bedford Stuyvesant.
Yes, I'm Winston Severa, former chapter leader of Harris Truman High School in the Bronx, teaching chemistry and biology. Presently, I'm UFT advocate working in the landlord office.
I'm Michael Hirsch, staff, New York Teacher newspaper.
Oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Sean Blank from chapter leader ISD 92 in Brooklyn. Also, I teach middle school math.
So those of you who I haven't given the kit of stuff yet, I have one more here, but the rest of you, if you give me your names, we will mail it to you, because I ran out of the precious Albert Schenker bags that are an essential part of the kit. So I actually wanted to start by asking our panelists tonight, and I do want to say that it's unfortunate that Jules Bernstein couldn't make it tonight. Part of that was a problem of me trying to do too many things and telling him originally it was March 26th rather than February 26th. But his wife is also ill, and he needs to spend some time with her. So we certainly understand, but he was very disappointed that he couldn't make it here tonight to participate. What I'd like to do is ask each of the people on my panel, starting with Rochelle, to briefly introduce yourself and tell us something about your life, what you did, other than what we're going to talk about tonight, so people have some way of situating your comments tonight.
Okay. Well, the first thing I think I want to say to you is that I want to thank Leo for inviting me, because this is a sentimental journey for me. I began my political life at Brooklyn College, and one of my classmates was Sandra Feldman, then Abramowitz, and somebody named Tom Kahn, who played a big role in the march. And the other reason I am very glad to be here is it gives me a chance to talk about Bayard Rustin, who was probably the best political organizer, best strategist, leader of the movement, and certainly the man who, when he met me at 17, helped develop me to my full potential that I didn't know I had, believe me. I could go on forever, so you should just have to stop me, but the fact of the matter is that in my life, I've had two essential jobs. From 1957 until 1972, I worked for Bayard Rustin, sometimes paid, sometimes unpaid, sometimes on unemployment insurance, but nevertheless, I worked for Bayard. And then in 1972, when Al Shanker became president of the AFT, I went from protest to politics and went down to Washington and became the first political director of the AFT. So I retired as a full-time political director of the AFT in 1996, and consulted to 2000, and I've been retired ever since. But I'm just it's amazing. I think probably those of us who are here, just amazing to be back in this building. I mean, I spent my life, the Randolph Institute rented office space from the UFT down at 260 Park Avenue South. And I have to tell you, I miss that old building. I mean, this makes me feel like a rube, you know.
It's all condominiums now.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the neighborhood got all posh. So anyway, I'm very glad to be here, and I love talking about the march and my youth. And I know everybody here on this panel since they were 10 years old, with the exception of Walter, who is younger than the rest of us. I don't know if Velma wants me to admit, but you,
I'll admit it.
Walter is younger. But certainly, my whole political life has been in the civil rights movement and the labor movement. And I think, what you're doing is incredibly valuable.
Velma, you want to go next?
Okay. I did make some notes, and let me say, first of all, that I didn't think this was going to happen, that we would actually be able to do this. I remember at the last A. Philip Randolph Institute conference, there was a tribute to Bayard Rustin, well-deserved. And after that tribute, Norman and Anthony and I were talking, and we said, there should be lesson plans on Bayard, and sort of went into the air. And then Leo turned up. And we spoke to Leo, and Leo said, terrific. We're going to do it. We're going to do it for the March on Washington. We're going to do it for Randolph. We're going to do it for Bayard. And I have to tell you, I was pleasantly surprised. Sometimes you have ideas and they don't come to fruition. Well, this one has, and it's so important because I think most of you know when you talk to students and you ask them about civil rights, they tell you about Martin Luther King and his speech, and they tell you about Malcolm X, but they don't know very much else. And it gives us an opportunity to correct some history and to have students learn something important. And let me say that when I'll just talk to you a little bit about me. That's hard, but somebody stop me. Rochelle will stop me. She always does. My career started as a kid, not much older than some of your students, and I was in the NAACP, and we decided, the audacity of youth, to integrate a beach in Chicago. And we did, and it was really very much like the South in that it was bloody and there were hundreds of people around saying, nigger go home and that kind of thing. This was Chicago. But I met Norm Hill and married him, and that changed my life because through Norm, I met A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin, and left Chicago and went to work for CORE. Norm was the program director of CORE, and I was the East Coast Regional Director of CORE. And in that capacity, and I'll talk to you a little bit about Bayard. I worked with Bayard on the 1964 school boycott, which was organized by a coalition headed by Milton Galamison. I think some of you
George
heard.
is laughing, so it's time to stop.
You remember that, George? Yeah. Anyway, I worked with Bayard on that one, and believe it or not, some reporter came over to my house to talk to me about that boycott. And I thought that was very good. It was on Channel 11, and it was probably one of the biggest demonstrations. I think it had 450,000 young people who didn't go to school that day. But I worked with Bayard on that. He organized that. That was right after the March on Washington. And in the March on Washington, Norm was loaned from CORE. And I was with CORE too, so I wasn't loaned to the march, but I did help organize CORE people. And I was involved in the initial meetings where the call was developed for the march. And then I left there, and, you know, after you meet Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, you can't help it, you just learn. So I learned a lot from both of them. And I then went to SEIU. Okay, now you can stop. Okay.
Jump right ahead to the
Okay.
UFT.
Okay, well, I went to SEIU after I organized paraprofessionals, organized 10,000 paraprofessionals in New York and then all around the country. And through all of this, I have to tell you that whenever I was in trouble, of course I went to Al Shanker, but my mentor was Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. And they really did help with the organization of the paraprofessionals. Anyway, I'm going to stop. Rochelle has told me to stop. But I just want to say one other thing, and that is that Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph didn't just have a point of view about domestic problems. They both felt that the struggle for freedom did not stop at the water's edge. And so that when I went to SEIU, I became, I think, the first international affairs director and went to Africa and the Caribbean, organizing and doing training for trade unionists. And Bayard was always in the background. He was that person that we went to when there was a problem or when there was an African student or African trade unionist that came over. We always managed to take them to see A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. So I just want to say that I am happy to be here, and I'm happy you're here, and thanks a lot. That's
Good.
it.
Walter.
Thank you all for coming out. I was not at the March on Washington, 1963, August. I was a 13-year-old kid growing up in suburban New Jersey. Yes, I know. The sympathy cards can be addressed to. But I was a pretty serious kid, and I think if I had lived in Washington, or if my parents had lived in Washington or had been political activists, I probably would have been at the march. In any case, as I said, I was a pretty serious kid. I was raised a Roman Catholic. I was kind of religious at that point in my life. And I really became taken with the whole idea of pacifism and nonviolence. And of course, at that time, this was being played out on the front pages of the newspapers every night and on the television channels through the vehicle of the African American Civil Rights Movement. And so, I mean, this was like history that was just being played out in front of my eyes. And it, you know, it's one thing to read about these ideas and this philosophy in a book, but to see it actually happening is, you know, you feel like you're right there, even if you're in suburban New Jersey. And as I went on in high school, I started considering my own options vis-a-vis the draft and the Vietnam War, and I decided I was going to become a war resister. So I started getting literature from a couple of organizations. One of them was the Fellowship of Reconciliation, another one is the War Resisters League, and both of these organizations were groups that Bayard Rustin had been involved in as a younger man and still had some affiliation with. And so here I was reading about the civil rights movement, this guy's name was popping up. I was getting literature from anti-war groups, this guy's name was popping up. It was like, you know, this guy must be really somebody pretty significant, pretty important. I met him in 1977, and we became partners for the last decade of his life. And during that 10-year period, I went to work with him at the Randolph Institute. My first job was a part-time job organizing A. Philip Randolph's papers. Mr. Randolph had died in 1979, and he had left his papers to the Library of Congress. And there was really nobody there to organize them and get them down there. So I sat down with a very elderly man, Ernest Rice McKinney, who probably, well, George probably, and Gene Glaberman knows, and Jeannie. And Mr. McKinney was kind of like a mentor to me and an advisor to me, because we would be going through papers and it would be, well, save this, don't save this, that kind of thing. And then later on, I went to work directly with Bayard and did some traveling with him on some of his international missions in the last years of his life. We went to South Africa together, to Haiti, to El Salvador, the Dominican Republic, sometimes observing elections, sometimes investigating refugee situations. So I got to know, obviously I got to know him very well. So with that, I think I'll pass the mic along to Norman. You know, I hope we'll have some good discussions about Bayard's role and the importance of the march.
Norman.
I'd like to take just a few minutes and talk about how my life intersected with A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin. After completing military service in 1958, I was invited to a conference of what was then the Young People's Socialist League, and I heard Bayard speak for the first time. I was, really awed by his analytical ability, his militance, his charisma. And Bayard took some of us at the conference to meet A. Philip Randolph, whom again, I was really awed by the dignity and special presence that A. Philip Randolph had. And I overheard them talking about a youth march for integrated schools that would take place in the fall of 1958. I went on to Chicago and began graduate work at the University of Chicago. There was a brief, sort of one-paragraph reference to the Youth March for Integrated Schools in the fall of 1958 in Chicago Sun-Times. But later on that winter, Bayard came to speak at the University of Chicago, and he indicated that he and Randolph were organizing a second Youth March for Integrated Schools. And so I went up to Bayard and said, "What can I do to help?" And he challenged me by saying, "Organize Chicago." I'd never done anything like that before. And I went to some Democratic Socialist friends who were active in and around the NAACP for advice. And they suggested that I approach the leadership of what was then the United Packing House Workers of America, who gave me an office and a phone. And I began going around the city speaking to any youth group I could, high school and or college, and ended up recruiting 8 busloads of youth to go from Chicago to Washington, D.C. for the Youth March for Integrated Schools. Bayard asked me to come in early, and they sent me a plane ticket. I flew in, and much to my surprise and shock, Bayard said I was to speak. To this day, I don't remember what I said. But that was in 1959. In the course of organizing the 8 busloads of youth, I dropped out of graduate school and have never went back. In 1960, when I was executive secretary of the Illinois Socialist Party, Bayard asked Joan Sewell and myself to coordinate a demonstration in conjunction with the March on Conventions movement that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin were organizing, whose purpose was to press the Democratic and Republican parties at their conventions to adopt a strong civil rights plank in their platforms. The Republican convention was in Chicago, and so Joan and I together organized a demonstration at the Republican convention, ending up assembling some 3,000 people. In 1961, with Bayard's intervention and help, James Farmer hired me as East Coast Field Secretary, and I moved to New York to join the staff of the Congress of Racial Equality, where I helped to coordinate weekend sit-ins integrating restaurants along Route 40 from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and participated in a number of anti-discrimination employment campaigns generating jobs for blacks. I'll skip what happened in between for our later part of our discussion. But I did, after leaving Congress of Racial Equality, join the Industrial Union Department of the AFL-CIO as civil rights liaison and legislative representative. In 1967, Bard asked me to join the staff of the A. Philip Randolph Institute as associate director. One of my first assignments given to me by Bard was to go to Memphis to work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference staff and the staff of the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, generating community support for the striking sanitation workers. I was in Memphis when King was killed and got to the Lorraine Motel shortly after. He died in time to see the blood still flowing. I next got involved with Bard, who came to Memphis and organized what was then a march not just in support of the striking sanitation workers, but a memorial march to King. I continued working at the Randolph Institute and was then assigned to generate a base for A. Philip Randolph and Bard Rustin. And I then, with the help of AFL-CIO staff, International Union staff, state AFL-CIO staff, began organizing local affiliates of the A. Philip Randolph Institute, made up of black trade unionists welcoming anyone who shared our commitment to racial equality and economic justice. In so doing, the Randolph Institute became the first black-led organization to conduct, on a national basis, voter participation drives in black areas around the country. The affiliates that I was able to organize existed in just about any place where there's any black population and union membership, in some 36 states plus the District of Columbia. I became executive director of the Randolph Institute in 1975 and president in 1980 until 2004, when I retired and now president emeritus of the A. Philip Randolph Institute.
Thank you. So I think what we should do next is go right to the 1963 march.
Excuse me?
Sure.
Before you get right to the 63 March,
Yes.
I think you hear from what Norm said and what Velma said about marches. The history of the movement and leading up to the march is very complicated and very rich. And I know you can't do it in a study, but if just 1 minute or 2 minutes, I just like to just go do a brief history of what went on in the civil rights movement. That is, after the Civil War, and at the end, there were various movements for black freedom, and the theoretical leader of the movement for freedom was, as you probably have all heard, was Booker T. Washington, and his theory was, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And that was the way he saw equality would come around for black people. He is followed in a few years by W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a founder of the NAACP, whose theory is, and these are serious arguments going on, intellectual arguments about how do we move this movement forward, who then says we can do it with the process of the talented tenth. That is, in the black community, there is this 10%, and they will flourish. And along comes A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph is the first person to talk about mass action. He adds a new dimension to it. He argues theoretically in the Messenger newspaper for mass action. He argues for black workers being involved. And then on top of Randolph comes Bayard, who adds the dimension of nonviolence. Now, Randolph was never violent, or never for violence, but nevertheless, he was mainly a march and demonstration, mass action guy, and Bayard comes along and adds this very important theoretical line that in order to get equality in this country, blacks are going to have to engage in nonviolent action. First, he was theoretically and principally a pacifist, but he also knew that a minority would get killed. and he was trying to save black lives. And he was also trying to get sympathy for the black movement. So there is this history and a debate that spans 100 years. And I know you can't do it in an elementary school plan, but I think you should have it in the back of your mind, because a lot of the stuff that I find frustrating about the march is one day 150,000 people came to Washington and marched. Well, the fact of the matter is 250,000, right. Actually, 1 million.
Give or take.
But it's a long and complicated history, which some of you might want to take some time and read about, and I'm sure the historians will go into that. But.
Yes, and I mean, we're giving people whatever they want in terms of biographies of them, and you know, there is. I'm sure you all know that Bayard Rustin played an absolutely pivotal role in the Montgomery boycott, in terms of providing support and aid and advice to King, and actually building it as a nonviolent movement. So we're moving on to the 1963 March on Washington, and I think we'd like to know from each of you, what was your involvement in that march? What did you do? Maybe we'll start with Norman.
Again, with Bayard's intervention, James Farmer, who was then National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, loaned me to the March staff. Bayard gave me the title of staff coordinator, although I never really coordinated any staff. But I spent much of my time on the march traveling to northern, midwestern, and upper southern cities, utilizing the March Policy Committee, which is made up of A. Philip Randolph and 5 other major civil rights leaders, plus a Protestant leader, a Catholic leader, and a Jewish leader, and a labor leader, and would urge them to contact their local affiliates, branches, locals, in advance of my coming to a city, to urge them to begin to form local coalitions to generate participation for the March on Washington. So I traveled from city to city doing that. And that was my major responsibility in the March on Washington. I went from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., where I'd also organized a local coalition for March participation a few days before the march, and was actually on the platform when the major speakers took the podium, starting with A. Philip Randolph and ending with Martin Luther King Jr. But again, I remember this tremendous outpouring and the positive political climate and momentum that the march generated, leading under the leadership of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights to the passage of the monumental Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. But that was my major responsibility on the March staff as staff coordinator.
Good. Well, I can be very brief. I watched it on television, read about it in the newspaper.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Okay, fine. My role with the March on Washington was not very important either. I was not a part of the policy committee, although I remember distinctly meetings at Bayard's house with Norman and Tom Kahn, who most people don't know about, but who was an incredibly important figure both in the early civil rights movement and in the March on Washington. He was this brilliant writer who could take a phrase and he treated it like a diamond, you know? And when he got through with it, it was clear as crystal. He passed away 1992. 92. But unfortunately, we don't hear very much about Tom Kahn. Tom Kahn was really magnificent. What I did was, in New York, go around to core chapters to make sure that core had representation at the march. But what I did, I attended meetings, various meetings, but Jim Farmer said clearly that he had given Norman to the march, and he wasn't going to give anybody else to the march. And so what I did essentially was to do work for CORE in the New York area and participate in the march just in terms of getting people out. I just want to say a few things about the march. Unfortunately, when people talk about the march, they talk about Dr. King's speech, and it was magnificent. But the March on Washington was for jobs and freedom. And I think Martin Luther King was the only one who spoke that day who didn't have the economic component.
He did. Nobody ever hears
No.
that part of the speech.
No, it was done in Detroit. But, well, anyway.
We'll debate
I didn't
that
hear
point.
it, you know,
That's
okay?
the problem. Nobody listens to
Okay.
the whole speech.
And I listened to the whole speech. But anyway, and Martin Luther King was very important and a very important figure. And I think if Bayard or Randolph were here, they wouldn't be so upset about the fact that people talk about King and nothing else about the march. But those of us who were a part of the Randolph Institute, or those of us who know about it, get a little nervous that Bayard and Randolph are not mentioned. And hopefully we can correct that. Now, there are several things that was very important to me when I attended the March on Washington. One was that it seemed to me to be the culmination of both Bayard and Randolph's principles, because here you had 250,000 people nonviolently marching for jobs and freedom. And part of the things that I learned from Bayard and Randolph, the principles I learned, was one, that nonviolence was very important. And if you couldn't do it because you really believed in nonviolence, you had to do it for tactical reasons. And I remember discussions that Bayard had with Stokely Carmichael and all kinds of people who were SNCC. They were talking about violence and how you could overthrow things violently. And I remember distinctly Bayard explaining that you couldn't do that in the United States. You couldn't do it when you were a numerical minority, that you had to have coalitions. And I think it was Bayard who really understood coalitions and taught the whole movement about the importance of coalitions. I remember his talking to a paraprofessional workshop that we organized about coalitions. And he would say, hey, if you want to have a coalition, you got to bring together people who have similar goals. He said, I wouldn't ask Malcolm X to be a part of a coalition for integrated schools, because what we would do is fight about his theory and my theory. I would get people in that coalition who were going the same way. So he taught, I think he taught the movement about coalition politics and how that could lead to a majoritarian thrust, a democratic thrust, and that you couldn't do that if you had violence. So that was part of the principles that I learned, and I hope that you will teach, you will put in the lesson plan. The other thing was the mass action the mass action did not fall out of the sky. I think it really did come from A. Philip Randolph and Bayard, who really understood the importance of the marches and the boycotts and mass action. So that was very, very important. Also, what was important was self-determination, that those people who were affected by discrimination had to be a part of solving that problem for themselves. You couldn't have somebody else do it. You had to be a part of it. And we learned that from Bayard too. And there were certain things that I learned from Bayard Rustin and from A. Philip Randolph that I hope that you will impart to students through your lesson plans, because there were principles that guided them through their lives. You saw it in the boycotts of the schools in '64. You saw it in the March on Washington. You saw it in their whole attitude about democracy and what was important. What was also important was that principle that you couldn't have real freedom without economic justice too, that they went together, that the class and the race thing were intricately involved in each other. And I think we learned that from both Mr. Randolph and from Bayard Rustin. And I remember that civil rights leaders were very reluctant about that class thing. And it took them years before they really talked about the economic thrust and how important it was. And I think we can credit both Bayard and Mr. Randolph to bringing those things together and also putting forth from protest to politics, that whole idea that civil rights was important, that the lunch counter was important to integrate, but we had to move beyond that. And we had to go to changing institutions. So when I think about the March on Washington, I think about it as the culmination of all of these principles that Bayard and Randolph had espoused for many, many years.
I left out one thing. That is, Randolph did ask Bayard, Tom Kahn, myself, and Velma to develop a plan for the march. And we worked and developed a plan that included a 2-day demonstration with civil disobedience and sit-ins at congressional offices. That later, as the march evolved, and as the coalition broadened, was dropped from the march, and the main focus became the march itself. But we did get involved in the early planning at Randolph's request.
Can't take it. Leo just gave the chair to me. I'm going to try to really be brief so that you can ask us questions. I think you have. We all know more than anybody needs to hear tonight. But I just want to say one thing about that. Norm is being modest about his role in the march. That first of all, that wasn't exactly a planning memo. It was a memo that was sent to Mr. Randolph to urge him to, in fact, start the March on Washington once again. And Norm and Tom Kahn played an essential role in doing that. And Norm is also underestimating his field work. What he did is he went out into communities where the leader of the NAACP was fighting with the leader of the church group, who was fighting with the Urban League group, who didn't like the trade unionists. Yeah. And he wound up putting together March on Washington committees that were harmonious. I mean, that's the reason he never saw the staff, is he spent his entire life putting out fires and putting people together. So I think he was a little modest in his
I can attest to that.
Yeah, in his presentation. I, at the time of the march, was 24. I had been around Bayard for 1957. I had been on 3 marches. And Bayard looked at me, it's similar to Norm's story, and said, "You're going, my dear," Bayard had two ways of speaking, the real way, and sometimes he had a West Indian accent, which he would use on occasion when he wanted authority. And he said something like, "My dear, you are going to be the transportation coordinator." And I said, "You're crazy, I can't even drive." I don't know what that has to do with being transportation director, but that's what I said. And also, every time I had been to Washington on a demonstration, I had lost my bus, so I didn't think I was good. But he said I was compulsive, and he was very perceptive, and that he knew that I would not lose one bus captain, and I was going to do it. And so you didn't say no to Bayard for more than 3.5 seconds, and eventually I did it, learned more, and actually, and it was actually an incredible experience. And I consider myself, that is, as a 17-year-old kid, Tom Kahn and I wandering up to an office where Bayard, Rustin, and Ella Baker were working, just incredibly lucky that we were let in to participate in history. And I'm just going to stop, and I'm going to say one sentence that this little disagreement between Velleman and me and Dr. King. I think, and I don't think she disagrees, that the "I Have a Dream" segment of that speech is poetry. It is what has given that march immortality, and that it was incredibly vital. The problem is that people don't like the harder part of it. The harder part of it is the jobs part of it. And it's up to those of us to keep on pushing that part. But if it weren't for Dr. King's immortal "I Have a Dream" thing, you would not be hearing about it today. So one has to live in this complicated world, but that part was magnificent. And my frustration always is, would somebody please listen to the whole speech? Because the speech also has a plea in it for nonviolence, for discipline, and he tries to get at the economic part by talking about the balance of the checkbook and what has been. He does try it, but he knows what his job is. Dr. King's job was to set the moral tone. He was the last speaker, and he did it beyond anybody's expectation. The other thing that it's worth reading is, of course, a Philip Randolph speech, which is the economic speech. So you will get it there.
Good.
Leo, to underscore and emphasize what Rochelle just said, I think it might be worth a few minutes to talk about the demands of the march, because there is a continuing relevance from many of the demands, even today, given the current economic and social climate in which we find ourselves, and as well as politically. So I would just suggest, if we could, spend a few minutes talking about the demands. I brought them so that they could be read.
Go ahead.
Well, he can't read. Gino reads them.
Oh, okay. You're going to read, okay.
There are 10 demands. 1, comprehensive and effective civil rights legislation from the present Congress without compromise or filibuster to guarantee all Americans access to all public accommodations, decent housing, adequate and integrated education, and the right to vote. 2, withholding of federal funds from all programs in which discrimination exists.
Could you just stop a minute at each demand?
Yes.
When you say the right to vote, we passed the civil rights legislation, but right now, the right to vote is under assault at the Supreme Court. So, I mean, go ahead. I'll just...
Yes, the Voting Rights Act is in jeopardy with the conservative Supreme Court, that it may very well rule the Voting Rights Act to no longer be relevant or necessary.
I think I'll stop after each one, so it'll be a discussion. 2, withholding of federal funds from all programs in which discrimination exists. 3, desegregation of all school districts in 1963.
Well, it's 50 years later.
Well,
You all know that.
But we have that de jure, or certainly not de facto, where school segregation still exists, primarily because of housing patterns.
And race.
Which is related to economics, of course.
Go ahead. 4, enforcement of the 14th Amendment, reducing congressional representation of states where citizens are disenfranchised.
Well, the Republicans are now trying to do just the opposite. There's now a movement, obviously, to disenfranchise the voters.
Right. 5, a new executive order banning discrimination in all housing supported by federal funds.
You got that.
6,
We have a Fair Housing Act of 1968, but it's difficult to enforce because the definition of discrimination is ambiguous in the law.
6, authority for the Attorney General to institute injunctive suits when any constitutional right is violated. 7, a massive federal program to train and place all unemployed workers, Negro and white, on meaningful and dignified jobs at decent wages.
It's called a stimulus program. That doesn't get passed.
But with unemployment at high rates, double that of white workers among blacks and Hispanics, we need such a program today.
8, a national minimum wage act that will give all Americans a decent standard of living. Government surveys show that anything less than $2 an hour fails to do this.
But I mean, if anybody who listened to Barack Obama's State of the Union address heard the cry for an increased minimum wage, and all I can think of is, okay, Barack, you're ready for August 28th. I mean,
Yeah, the minimum wage has not kept up with the cost of living or inflation, and there's still a poverty wage at $7.25 an hour today.
and what it hasn't been raised in what, 16, 17 years?
That's right.
9, a broadened Fair Labor Standards Act to include all areas of employment which are presently excluded.
Well, the Fair Labor Standards Act today doesn't include domestic workers or farm or agricultural workers.
Finally, 10, a federal Fair Employment Practices Act barring discrimination by federal, state, and municipal governments and by employers, contractors, employment agencies, and trade unions.
We do have that, this implementation, which is a problem.
Yes.
And I think in terms of your work on your lesson plan, something that you might want to look at is the freedom budget that A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin developed after the March on Washington, which really was an effort to put into a programmatic basis the demands which inspired the march. Now, there are a number of interesting issues around the march, which I'm sure those of you who've been through the books are well aware of. I'll just mention 3 of them, then I'm going to throw it open for the teachers to raise whichever ones you want to. You all don't have to respond to this because I just want to put them on the table. And one very interesting issue is the effort to gay-bait Bayard out of his leadership role in the march that took place in its most public form, in its most insidious form, in a speech by the arch-segregationist Strom Thurmond in the United States Senate. But also, there were less noble efforts among some of the more conservative leadership in the civil rights community. And A. Philip Randolph took a very strong and principled position on that, and I think that's something that you might want to discuss. Another issue that is interesting is the relationship, because we're talking here about the trade union movement, the civil rights movement, the relationship of different parts of the trade union movement to the march. It certainly is the case that if you want the more progressive wing of the trade union movement, led by Walter Reuther, including the AFT, was very strong in support. But they weren't able to bring George Meany, who was the head of the AFL-CIO, into that. He resisted that. And so I think that's something that might be of some interest that you want to discuss. The last thing is and those of you who've had a chance to read the chapter from Norman and Velma's book that we shared with you, is the relationship of Malcolm to the march.
I didn't know we shared it.
We did share. I mean, those in their precious
Why did you share
Albert
it with us?
Schenker Institute bag, we gave them a copy of that chapter.
But that was really like a first draft. Okay.
That's all right.
Well, I don't mind.
I'm
I
sure.
haven't read it.
I'm sure that.
Nobody's read it that I know of.
Well,
They have.
now they are. So I think that you may have other issues that are of some importance to you, what I really want to do is kind of not so much direct this myself as facilitate questions from those of you who are doing this lesson plans, so that things that are of interest to you can be focused on. So let me just throw it open and see where you want to go with it. People are doing the lesson plans.
Well, I think one concern or question I have is I think, and even in my own thinking, I struggle with, I think my students don't realize that, and forgive me for saying so, but that the genesis is human beings doing these things and not necessarily superhuman beings. And so I know, in addition to what Leo just said, as far as in Barry Rustin's case, like his time in prison and chain gang, and I guess it was 3 years in total.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess I'm maybe hearing more about his person and just how not only his events, but just who you are too, frankly. How that kind of leads to doing these things, kind of give our kids maybe some access into who the people are and what they've struggled with. So I guess maybe a short question was like maybe how the circumstances might influence him and his actions moving forward, if that's clear.
Walter? Yeah, well, I'll certainly open that up. Bard was somebody that had a lot of baggage, if you will. He was a pacifist. He was a conscientious objector during World War II, which was not a very popular thing to be. He had a flirtation, or maybe a little bit more than a flirtation, with the Young Communist League, and he was gay. And those three things were constantly being thrown up in his face as a way of pushing him to the sidelines or stopping him from doing what he wanted to do. At the same time, facing all these obstacles and coming from the kind of childhood and the background that he came from, he was not somebody that was going to let anybody turn him around. And so he would find a way to reinvent himself and get himself back into the movement. I think these are things. You all have a copy of Brother Outsider, I think, in your bags. All of these things are dealt with, and I think you have to kind of face them head on with Bard, because if you don't, you're accused of covering up or whitewashing or that kind of thing. And I think the filmmakers took that on pretty well. What happened in 1963, because all of this stuff, as I said, had been used in the past. There were attempted demonstrations at the 1960 Democratic and Republican conventions that Bard was organizing. And at that time, Adam Clayton Powell went to the press and said there were, quote unquote, immoral elements working in the civil rights movement. And basically said to Dr. King, if you don't pull out of this, I'm going to go to the press and say that you and Bard Rustin are having a love affair, which was not true. What happened in 1963 is that under the leadership of Mr. Randolph, who was a person of tremendous integrity and also a person that you couldn't blackmail, because I don't think he ever did anything wrong in his life. So under his leadership, he was able to bring the other civil rights leaders, those who doubted whether Bard should be the deputy director, people like Roy Wilkins and some of the others, and said, no, we're going forward with this thing. And I think also by the time that Strom Thurmond stood up on the Senate floor, I think we were 2 to 3 weeks before the march. I mean, this thing was like a train coming down the track, and nobody was going to turn it around. And so even if they had wanted to, President Kennedy appealed that the march be stopped, and there were newspaper articles, I have some of them here, saying that this should be called off. But at that point, it was too late to do anything. So it really kind of forced the civil rights leadership to unite under Mr. Randolph's leadership and say, we're standing behind this guy. And once that happened, all of those charges against Bard really couldn't be used again to shuttle him off to the sidelines. By the way, some of these documents that we have talked about, the memo that Norm and Tom Kahn wrote, the program from the March on Washington, an article about the AFL-CIO, not endorsing the march, Mr. Randolph's speech, I have a lot of that stuff, so if you'd like to have it, you could let
Yeah,
me know and I
if
could
you-
scan it.
If you give it to me, I'll
send it to you.
scan it and get it to everybody.
Okay.
I think the same thing with the demands there.
Yes, the demands
Yeah,
as well.
they're in the program, actually, so.
Norman, did you want to add something?
Yes, I think it's important to note that A. Philip Randolph, being the oldest and most respected, and having the greatest standing among the other civil rights leaders, it was agreed that he ought to chair the march. And he said that he would chair the march on one condition, that he be given the right to name his deputy to do the day-to-day organizing. And he named Byard. It was Randolph who also stood firm when Strom Thurmond attacked Byard on the floor of the Congress, calling him a pervert, a communist, and a draft dodger. That Randolph said, we have absolute confidence in Byard, and he will continue without any reservations as deputy director and chief organizer of the march. One other thing that Randolph made, in retrospect, a rare tactical mistake when he approached Walter Reuther first about supporting the march, and Reuther said, I'll support it whether Meany does or not, whatever Meany does. And given the rivalry between Meany and Walter Reuther, Meany said, I will show Walter Reuther who really runs the AFL-CIO. And as a consequence, the AFL-CIO did not endorse. But it was not just the auto workers and steel workers, but the clothing workers, the garment workers, the teachers, and other unions that sent significant delegations and a great number of participants in the march.
Any other?
Well, I was going to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Norm is, just one thing, when you think A. Philip Randolph, I've been talking to a lot of reporters these days because they're doing documentaries and stuff about the march, so I have to describe A. Philip Randolph to 25-year-old reporters. And I finally figured out a way to do it. I said, think Nelson Mandela. So if you think of the persona of Nelson Mandela, you get the persona of A. Philip Randolph. And the fact that A. Philip Randolph stood behind Byard being gay is only so incredible because Randolph was a Victorian gentleman. He read to his wife from Shakespeare every night. He, if you read the books, I mean, I don't even think he knew what gay meant, but all he knew is that Byard had integrity and he stood by him. So I think and he was just a very, maybe you have Jervis's book about Randolph, but Randolph, when he was organizing the Pullman car porters, had been given a blank check by the Pullman company. And they said to him, you fill in the amount, just stop organizing this union. And he ripped up that check. And he was living at that point in a little two-bit apartment in Harlem being supported by his wife. So I mean, this is a man of incredible integrity. The second thing that Norm talks about Meany, it is a very complicated question. And Norm is absolutely right that Randolph went to Reuther first and Meany got PO'd. But there was a second problem, and that is there was a big debate in Washington among our best friends about whether we should march or not. Some people, liberals, thought, first of all, so many black people had never masked on the mall, and they thought, oh, there's going to be riots. So there was hysteria. There was the Kennedy administration hysteria that riots were going to break out, and certainly black people couldn't monitor themselves. Then there was the fear that that action would mean that the Civil Rights Act that John F. Kennedy introduced would not get passed. And one of the things that happened in the AFL-CIO is there was a legislative director, his name was Andy B. Miller, and he was just hysterical. You're not going to pass the bill. And so there was this tug of war, and even at the beginning of the march, Byard called them the latrine letters, We got letters from the best friends in the Senate that the civil rights movement had, Senator Paul Douglas, Hubert Humphrey, and the letters all began, "Dear Bayard, we know this is going to be a great day, and we know this is you have a great movement, and that your aims are worthwhile, but have you thought about what it really means to bring so many people to Washington? Will there be enough toilets? And will there be enough fountains?" But we didn't know why it was. There was the toilet letter, the latrine letter, and it was coming in from all of our friends. I, in later years, found out that there was actually a division in the Justice Department, led by somebody named John Douglas, who was Paul Douglas's son under Bobby Kennedy, and another guy named John Riley, who I became friendly with. And their job was they were getting liberals to write letters saying, "We're really for you, but this is not going to work." So it was, and Meany got caught up in that, and it's too bad. Years later, he told Jervis Anderson, who was Randolph's biographer, that it was the greatest mistake he ever made, not endorsing the march. And certainly, I read in the Kallenberg book today, and it's wrong, that Meany pressured people not to. He did not pressure anybody not to do it. And
That's right.
I mean, any union that wanted. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is that these reporters who are calling me say things like, "Oh, there were unions at the march. There were unions." So I've spent right here in New York. There's a guy from CNN working. I spent a lot of time saying, "Oh yeah, there were unions." I mean, that there were institutions that had to get people to the march, because the other thing that I think one has to explain to students is that this is before Facebook, social media, cell phones. I mean, this is like horse and buggy days. So the fact of the matter is, the only way that you could organize people was through institutions, through civil rights groups, through churches, through trade unions. And the group that gets forgotten a lot, I assure you, are the trade unions, which I think, being the bus maven of the march,
Right.
was after the civil rights groups and the black churches comes the trade union movement.
So you're speaking of before the days of social media. I was actually only 10 years old when the March on Washington happened. But certainly growing up in my activist youth, I learned how to do mimeograph machines by hand. So it's been a rather radical revolution in means of communication in this short time. I want to particularly call on teachers who are going to do the lesson plans for questions. And Steve.
I actually think helping kids think about how organizing worked then versus now would be a fun entry point for them that we can do a lot with. So I'm wondering, I mean, if you or anyone else has documentation of like where the buses came from and who was sending them, and if we could even just get like the raw records of those to share with kids and have them delve in and try to do some work with that, especially the math teachers in the group, I'm sure can have a lot of
One of the problems, there's a memo which I linked her which is in the Smithsonian exhibit. It's a very funny memo, that's it. And what it is, it's a memo from me to Bayard, and I list the number of buses coming from every area. Unfortunately, you don't have a big enough sense of history, when you're doing these things. I don't list where it's coming, but I list where they're coming from. And the funny thing about that memo is I conclude at the end of it that they're going to be, what did I say, 67,000?
Yeah, she even has a nominal amount. We could do some research, see what
Yeah,
the price is
and then there, I don't have, and Walter's tried to find who sent the buses, but there were 3 trains, and I have someplace, somewhere it exists. I know the UFT sent 4 buses. I know the UAW had 32 buses from New York because Walter just told me that. The IUE had 16. But the interesting thing about that memo is, when you're 24, or any of you 24, you're pretty sure of yourself. So I gave Bayard that memo and said to him, there are 67,620 people coming, and we wanted to have a minimum of 150,000, and we went into a deep depression. My God, said Bayard, we're not going to have enough people. And Bayard took that memo, which is, crazily typed, and he went to a meeting of the 10 chairmen, and this is when Roy Wilkins becomes my hero. Wilkins said, does she really know of 67,000 people who are coming? And Bayard said, yeah. He said, well, she doesn't know, Wilkins said. who on Tuesday night is going to roll over in the bed and say to his wife, let's drive down. She doesn't know who's going to take public transportation. She doesn't know how many people from Washington are going to appear. And he said, if you know that there are 67,000 people, you have names and cards and buses for them, we're going to really go over the top. And if you listen to Wilkins' speech, which is on exhibit at the Smithsonian, he begins his speech, and I consider it my line. He says, I'm glad you're all here because I didn't want to be made a liar. So it was Roy Wilkins who understood that. Does that mean I'm talking too long? This is like the Oscars.
Yeah, yes, the music's coming up.
Okay.
Bayard's papers are down at the Library of Congress. I have some material, but the bulk of his papers are at the Library of Congress, and they're on microfilm, microfiche, whatever they use nowadays. They're digitized, I think. So if you have access to a university library, a lot of university libraries have purchased his papers, and you might be able to find some of this material by going online even.
Anthony?
Yeah, I just want to say, I understand we're going to have another session.
With historians,
with
yeah.
historians. There's one historian, Eric Arneson, who's been doing work, who's doing a book on Randolph. And he has compiled all the names of all the unions who'd sent people to the march. So you might want to ask him about, you may want to ask him about that when we have that session.
I suspect the best place to find this information is in the FBI.
Yeah.
The FBI had monitors all over. They had people watching. David Garrow, the historian, once told me, you go to the Freedom of Information Act, they know where the buses left from in Ohio and from Pennsylvania, so there's always...
Yes.
They were busy doing that, not worrying about, you know.
We were talking earlier, so we got an opportunity to delve into the numbers and everything as far as the money, the economics of organizing it. For my younger children, they are, how should I approach kind of shifting the perspective of Martin as the speaker who set the tone, as opposed to like the hero and the way the younger generation sees him, as opposed to him, you know, being a major leader and organizer. He wasn't necessarily the organizer of the movement. Should we talk about the different groups, the different fractions, women, labor, civil rights, churches? I even saw something about India having a stake with their focus. I mean, they had something in the back of one of these, how they had something to do.
There's a document you have that Jeannie found in her attic, which is from 1942. It's very good historically, and it talks about, I mean, the struggle for freedom in India, and Gandhi plays a very important role, but with the nonviolence. But I think you don't have to worry about that for that.
Should I explore why he was chosen, when and where he entered the March, Martin, as far as his build-up with the babies?
There was no, you can't and you shouldn't, and it would be wrong to underplay his role. That is, until he signed on, there was Bayard, there was Randolph, there was the SNCC leader. Yes.
Okay.
And they needed him and they wanted him. He was, I mean, he had led the Montgomery bus protest. He was the moral leader.
Okay, we just brainstorming.
Yeah.
Could the theme be like the men behind the march?
Or
my younger babies, like third, second, third, and fourth. Okay.
I mean, you have to. You can't, and that they're, you know...
They're to just drill in their importance in the role they play.
I mean, it's a little bit like, and you're the teacher, and you knew in a minute how to do something, we talked about it earlier, that would have taken me days.
Oh, the numbers, that's the math.
Oh, boy, I couldn't, But, I mean, the problem is, it's like looking at life through a 30-second soundbite, and looking at life as a documentary. I mean, for instance, everybody knew from the minute the march started, except Jim Farmer, that Martin Luther King was going to be the last speaker. They knew he was the best speaker. They knew he would. In 1957, he gave a speech at the prayer pilgrimage called "Give Us the Ballot," which was pure poetry and program, and probably even better than "I Have a Dream." Nobody just knows. but he was there, he's it, but you just have to add that there were other people that made this movement great. And I quoted something the other day to a reporter that at one point Barack Obama gave a really wonderful speech, and where he talked about the Moses generation and the Joshua generation, and that he's referred to Martin Luther King and the leaders of the civil rights movement as the Moses generation, and that he was the Joshua generation carrying it out. And he said in that speech that I stand on the shoulders of Martin Luther King. And I said it to a reporter, so I'll say it to you, I think that Barack Obama stands on the shoulders of Martin Luther King Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the shoulders of Bayard Rustin.
And Randolph.
And Randolph and
And
Du
Martin
Bois
Randolph
and
stood on the shoulders of.
Right.
Yeah.
So just,
You know,
just a second, we'll get, procedurally, how to do this right, okay? So some of the teachers were here the first time, some of you weren't. So what I'm going to do is pass around a list just for the teachers to do names and emails, and we will create a little email list. And all of these documents I will have scanned and get to everybody, so we don't have to go through any complications, okay? Good.
I think you
Yeah.
could, I think it's important, especially with younger kids too. This was about a movement. It wasn't about one person. And everybody has a role that they can play in a movement. We can't all be Dr. Kings. Dr. King was a great speaker. He wasn't a great organizer. Bayard was a great organizer. He was also a great speaker, but he was not a great speaker like Dr. King. But we all have a role to play. And I think we have to use our individual talents and bring those to the movement. I mean, the role of women. I mean, there were women that were really, and a couple of them are sitting up here they were very involved in organizing the March on Washington, and certainly back in Montgomery days, but you don't hear about that. Now, that partly has to do with the sexism of the time, but they were not included in the program in the March on Washington, except in a very kind of ceremonial fashion. There were no women major speakers at the march. But but that had to do, again, with the times. But I think if you stress with kids, what is your particular talent? What can you contribute to that movement? Then you don't have a situation where everybody is sitting around waiting for one leader to come forward and organize something. We can all get together and work together and organize it.
Yes.
Organize something.
Yeah.
Velma?
Yeah.
Sure. Precisely that.
I do think,
What could you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I do think that it's important for people to understand that you wouldn't have had a March on Washington had you not had A. Philip Randolph. Because you had a group of civil rights leaders who couldn't agree with each other. I mean, there was SNCC who would say, well, if the Lord, meaning Martin Luther King, wanted something, we want more. And then there was this feeling among the March people that, well, like the SNCC people felt that the NAACP, they're only for courts. And then the Urban League is only for business. I mean, there were these things going, but A. Philip Randolph was the person who came into that meeting who everybody respected. Everybody there respected Randolph. And that's why I say it couldn't have happened had you not had somebody like A. Philip Randolph, who had a history of being, marching, who was called at one point the most dangerous black man in the country, who everybody knew at those meetings, everybody knew that Randolph was a man of his word. So he was able to bring that coalition together and to keep it together. And yes, Martin Luther King played a very, very important role. And I don't know whether you know about it. Do you know about the speech that, that King did? He was practicing. He practiced in Detroit. And in Detroit, when he made that speech, he talked a lot about jobs and the economic stuff. And he decided not to do that at the March on Washington. But, it was the most dramatic, dynamic speech of the march. It really was. I mean, I remember and I don't cry, being sort of in tears, seeing all those people there and hearing all those speeches. But, there were other good speeches there. And somehow it would be good for our students to hear some of the other speeches as well as King's speech. That's all.
I don't know how the lessons plans are going to be structured, but I would suggest that A. Philip Randolph himself and Bayard Rustin himself deserve a lesson plan, as well as the march.
Yep, we'll work on that. Other questions from teachers? No? All right, Anthony, yes?
Just a couple of observations. First, I want to say thank you so much for being here and sharing, this rich history with us this evening. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things. One, you talked about, protest the politics, and I read over the handout from, I guess you emailed it to me.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I thought was, the most profound is that people talk about, we want to fight to get the seat at the counter, right? But we can't afford to be at the counter, so, they're interrelated, right? The civil rights struggle and the whole economic thing or whatever. It's something that I think we should be very mindful that we don't miss, right? Martin mentioned it before about, the civil rights movement and the labor movement being kind of intertwined. Matter of fact, the AFL-CIO has since apologized and changed its position or whatever, and now there's this whole movement to build this coalition and this relationship with the with the civil rights movement. The other piece is, Gene read the list of demands, but I think the other part is, if we tell the story, we should tell the whole story. Like, we got this list of 10 demands, but it wasn't hunky-dory, it wasn't flowery, it wasn't rosary, and I think, Velma, you hit on it, because there were competing interests and all that other stuff, with SNCC and, the NAACP had their issues that they wanted to bring out, but how it all came together in this list of 10, came from that. So I think if we talk about lessons, how do we negotiate, how do we, make everybody feel they're part of the process, how do we, those types of things could be incorporated some way, shape, or form. So.
Camille.
Yes, Mr. Hill, I'm glad you mentioned about how important it was to mention Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, because recently we hung the poster from APRI in our school, commemorating the poster for Black History Month, and a couple of the children said, well, who is he? We've never heard of him. A. Philip Randolph. So it is very important that we mention these great men as part of the total picture, because they've been overlooked.
And congratulate him,
Right.
Anthony, on that poster.
Right.
And thank Anthony for your dinner, too.
Well, I'd just like to touch on the whole issue of from protest to politics, just briefly. We were talking a little bit earlier. Well, I mean, one of the things I think you can think about, probably for some of the older kids, is, how do you go about making social change in a democracy? Now, the obvious answer is you vote. Well, yeah, but what if you can't vote? And African Americans couldn't vote to a large degree before the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So that was, if you can't vote, you have to use extra constitutional means, if you will. And that was the protest element, being out there in the streets and marching. Bayard always emphasized, well, once you have that right to vote, it's really your duty and your responsibility to use it. So if you're going to march, you march to the ballot box, and that's where you get involved politically. He didn't ever give up the idea of protest. Sometimes you had to go back out into the streets and use it. But once you had the political power available to you, it was really your responsibility to use it, to organize.
I have 6 grandchildren ranging in age from 14 to 26, and I only raise this because, and I've talked to some reporters, it's sort of relevant for what, and you know much better than I do what kids are thinking these days. And 3 of my grandchildren went to school, and in February, one of them would say, during Black History Month, my Grams knew Martin Luther King Jr., and inevitably, in 3 classes, the answer was, is she still alive? and they could parrot that answer, right? But what's interesting, 3 of them live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I asked them if they could imagine a school where a black kid could not sit next to them. They can't imagine it. They don't understand. They don't remember what that period was like. And I'll tell you the issue that does cross barriers. One of my reporter friends these days, as we were discussing it, is black. He's 50 years old. He says he has kids, and he keeps on trying to tell them that the civil rights movement was important, and they say, Dad, leave us alone. They're black kids, right? The issue that does get them is gay rights. That is their civil rights issue. It is very interesting. So, you have to deal with it. I don't. You talk to the kids, and I'm not talking to any kids. I'm not talking about kids who are going to inner city schools now, who probably know things more than that. But there certainly is. Not only I find among kids today, not only do they not understand what it was like before Facebook, they don't understand what went on, even if you tell them, and so somehow you have to communicate to them the problems that existed. I mean, Route 40 going down from Washington from New York to Washington was a segregated route. You couldn't stop and eat at a lunch counter. Sandy Feldman participated, and I did too, in what we called, they weren't like the Southern Freedom Rides, but they were Northern Freedom Rides. At 6 o'clock in the morning, we'd get on a bus, and we'd take our cars, and we'd go stop in cafeterias to get integrated. During the March on Washington itself in 1963, there were only 2 hotels where we could always stay, the Statler Hilton and the Willard. No other hotels would have an integrated group. I mean, it is such a dichotomy. And I mean, even though there's so much, as we read the demands, there's so much that has to be done, simultaneously, there's such a different atmosphere that somehow you have to communicate to them, I think, the urgency of the march and the urgency, as Dr. King would say, the fierce urgency of now.
Yeah, I think there's also a lot that hasn't changed. So for 15 years, I taught in a good high school, a 5-minute walk from Park Slope, and I never had a single white student. This city certainly knows racially segregated schools to this very day, and some of our young people are going through the very same experience that people went through in terms of de jure segregation. It's still, the reality is still very similar for them. Yes?
I think it's also important to, like, in terms of just knowing how to make connections with kids. I remember taking kids on a trip one time to the 9/11 Memorial, and one of the teachers, she was so upset because they were like, when are we going to eat? And we were trying to explain to her, some of these kids weren't even born, or they, like, how old were they when this thing happened? So, and she was just so, like, offended that they weren't interested at all in just, but for her, it just touched her so deeply. But to see them, like, they were more concerned, when are we going to McDonald's? They had no interest at all in that. So you have to really know how to really reach them, because they don't, this generation is just
How old were they?
12.
Oh. You have to reach kids, you have to reach people, yeah.
In the back?
Yeah, I think, I agree with what people are saying about, contextualizing everything. And I also think that one thing that I've been able to do is start from the child's point of view and, like talk about the children's march and what the children and the high school students were doing at that time. And I was wondering how much is known or what is known about children participating. I know I have a close friend of mine who was maybe 15 and learned about the march at her high school through a Jewish group. And she got on a bus. She didn't know what was going on, but she got on a bus. It was her first march of probably 1 million by now. But, trying to find that perspective of a child going, or even a teenager.
I don't know which historians you're using.
Well, some of them haven't had a chance to look at, but the oral history that we gave you, I think, is particularly good in kind of capturing the experience of ordinary, people who.
But I want to suggest a historian for you. His name is Adam Green.
Yes.
He teaches social and black history at Northwestern University. He loves to come to New York. He is the son of Ernie Green, who was the first black graduate of Central High School in Little Rock. Adam was 18 months old, at the March on Washington. He's now a historian. He's a teacher. He knew Bayard and Tom Kahn and everybody else, but also he has that perspective. Adam is now 50 years old, and
Is he really? Oh, God.
Adam is. And I will tell you just one thing. I once asked his father, Ernie Green, who was the first black to graduate from Central High School in Little Rock, what it was like to go to school. And he said, it was really terrific. I was the only kid who had a soldier with me all the time. But that was his more happy, I think.
Yeah.
But I really think that if you could get a chance to get Adam involved, you get a unique point of view. And he's a great guy.
We're working on the historians.
Adam is now at the University of Chicago.
Yes,
And we actually talked.
he's the
to him
dean
about
at the University of Chicago.
I'm sorry, I said Northwest. His wife said Northwestern. He's
Yeah.
from University of Chicago.
Yeah.
We actually talked to him about it. He said he could maybe write something, but he just didn't have time.
To come and do it, to
Yeah.
talk?
Yeah, he just couldn't do
Okay.
it.
Well,
But
I
he
would-
is incredible.
One thing you could, if you're looking for a particular age group, if you put the march in the context of that particular summer, it was a very violent summer in this country, and especially in the South. And there were a lot of young people in Birmingham who were being shot down with fire hoses and sicked on by police dogs. And, they, depending on the age group that you're talking about, some of them were maybe the same age or maybe just a little bit older. So, I mean, that might be a way of tapping into that particular age group. The other thing, too, is, that was a summer of real terror, and I think that the March on Washington it changed the mood. I mean, it created a sense of hope and I think a sense of triumph. And the response to that was about 3 to 4 weeks later, 4 little girls were killed in a church in Birmingham with a bomb. So, I mean, that was a reaction, I think, to the turning around of the mood of the country. It was, a backlash, if you will. It didn't succeed. I think what it did is it generated more sympathy and more support for the civil rights movement. But those girls were, 12, 13, 14 years old.
No,
So
they were
it would
5
be
and
some
6.
way. No, they were older than that.
They were little kids. They were 4 and 5 in Birmingham.
All right, well, do your homework.
They weren't 13.
So, one thing
Do your homework.
that you might consider is
10, 11, 12.
one thing you might consider
You're
is particularly around high school students, the example of Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, one of whom was a college student from Queens College, who not all that much older than your own students are now, made a very conscious decision to put their lives at risk, knowing full well, what could happen, and in their case, what did happen. It's a way to bring home, some of the intensity of that moment that they may not really appreciate. Jeannie?
This was an integrated march and what that meant in terms of its political consequences and how much of thinking about the importance of it being an integrated march went into the planning, or did it just happen? I just remember that in my vague recollections that somehow the fact that this was an integrated march made a huge imprint on the American, political scene. This was not, you have talked about how there was all this fear and the Justice Department and everybody's thinking there are going to be riots and they're worrying about toilets, and all of a sudden you have this hugely integrated, wonderful day when people are out there and they're happy and they're together and the races are mixing. And I just wonder if you could talk about that.
Well, obviously, it's very interesting. The original March on Washington movement, started by A. Philip Randolph in 1941, was to be an all-black march. And it was done for really significant reasons. One, to demonstrate that black people could do it. Black people face a terrible stereotype in this country. And the second reason A. Philip Randolph wanted an all-black march was he didn't want the Communist Party to come in and try to take it over. So both of it worked out. By the time we reached 1963, there was still that feeling that this country had to be shown that black people were capable. I mean, it's hard to talk about this now, but it was true, and so it was consciously planned that first there would be the black leadership, the leaders of the 6 civil rights organizations would be the chairman, and then they would invite in as the coalition the white chairman who represented the who represented the labor movement, the Catholic Church, the Jewish community, and the Protestant community. So there was an effort. There was 2 things going on. One, this is a black run, black demands. We want it integrated, and there was very one of the reasons when Eugene read the demands is everybody was told these are the demands and these are the slogans. Nobody was going to carry a sign that said we're for animal rights or any other, or even we're for peace now. That is, the slogans had to be we demand equal rights. They had to be demands for the civil rights movement. And their white allies, I think, as Randolph would say, were invited to participate, and that was the basis on which people did.
George?
Yeah, I just want to amplify the role of labor, especially our union in this building. Tell me new building.
And it wasn't just 4 buses, and it wasn't just individuals on trains. I was an officer then, vice president of high school, but my main role in the union at that time was to be the strike chair, network, and use it for everything. For the march, we in the UFT officially endorsed the march. We not only organized the buses, but through the network, which was the strike network, which we also used in the boycott of '64, in that we organized carpools. I think we had many more teachers in the carpools than the buses, as I recall. And I think that it was a turning point, as you mentioned, in many ways, but it was the feeling that we had just, prior to that, collected about $50,000 or $60,000 to buy 5 or 6 big station wagons, and we had our militants drive them down and so on. So we were totally involved. I'm very proud of the fact that the AFT, and not just us, Detroit, Chicago, they sent people and so on. But I remember the AFSCME people from DC 37, they were there in force. Yes. And if I could just get the feeling of going down, when we were driving down, I was in a carpool with my car and other network people. And when we were going down, you were saying, is this going to be successful or not, Then all of a sudden the traffic started to get heavy, way before Washington, frankly in New Jersey. And then, it was like we were screaming. It was so great to see all these cars going down at buses. We saw the buses honking horns, and it was fabulous. And so labor, whenever I talk, and when I taught at both Franklin K. Lane and Stuyvesant, I taught it as the march for jobs and freedom. Always, always. Told everyone else that I could. We must do that because you can't have freedom without jobs. And that was a turning point for a lot of us to see that all over the country we could have such a successful endeavor. And one last thing, because we were only, we started the UFT in 1960, we got our first contract in '62, so it was right in the beginning of the UFT as we know it. But one last thing, when it was over, I was telling some people earlier before the meeting, I know my spot there. When we went, Leo, to a year ago or 2 years ago, March, I sat in the same spot, seeing, to the left of the Lincoln Center, the Lincoln Memorial. But when it was over, and I'll never forget this, there was not a lot of yelling and screaming. It was quiet and peaceful. It was like a dream. It really was a dream. And everyone, not only dreamed, but everyone had tears in their eyes. it was a proud day for me.
Michael?
I'm curious about what sort of press work you did. The reason I'm thinking about it is there was no media, no social media at the time, but there was FM radio, and there was underground newspapers. It was the Village Voice.
Yeah.
Village Voice did a story about it.
Yeah, Stephanie did.
Stone's Weekly pushed people to come. There was a whole panoply of radical newspapers, all of which were on board, all of which had largely white readerships. Well, I'm talking about the mainstream press. What sort of outreach did you do?
As I remember it, it wasn't either Norm's or my responsibility.
Yeah.
We had on loan at the March the public relations director of Local 1199, Mo Foner. And we had from the American Jewish Congress, Cy Posner,
Right.
who was a state legislator. And we had the NAACP PR department. And they coordinated. There were a lot of, thank God there was no cable news, I'll tell you, because the cable news would have had, oh, today Jim Farmer didn't come to the meeting, he was angry at Martin Luther King. Everybody would have known much too much that they didn't have to know. But no, well, actually, the march was broadcast was the first time. No. CBS TV broadcast the march from the beginning to the end. And I tell you, last year Walter and I went to the Paley Center to watch it, and it's really hilarious because they have reporters. It's very funny. They have I think it's Roger Mudd. Roger Mudd standing on a hill in Washington. He said, "The march has started. There is no violence yet." and then someplace else. But at the end of the day, was it Walter Cronkite? Or somebody with.
Well, what did they do?
They at the end of the day they summarized it. Anyway,
Yeah.
they had floor to ceiling coverage. I know this perfectly because for the first time in her life, my mother thought I was a useful human being. So there we go. So there was press, but we were followed around. Gabe Pressman became my best buddy because he followed us around. Harvey Swados did a brilliant article in The Nation. Life magazine did a series. It was much more traditional press than you know it. And Bayard they would all gather for real press conferences, and they would answer questions and stuff. So I don't know what they did specifically with the radio. I suspect that stations like WBAI, they take care of themselves.
They broadcast the whole thing.
Yeah, the Village Voice had two good articles, one by Stephanie Harrington, who happened to be married by Michael Harrington, so that was a little thing. And then Nat Hentoff, in his more progressive days, was a big buddy of Bayard's, and he covered it and did a series of it. There was a press operation, and the other thing that Bayard was very involved in and concerned about, and he spent a lot of money on. This is also the day before you had maxi screens. You know, Martin Luther King made the "I Have a Dream" speech down all the way from the Lincoln Monument to the Washington Monument, and everybody could only see him. They couldn't see him on a big screen. But Bayard was really concerned that everybody should hear, because he was really worried that obviously if you can't hear, crowds get restive and it's going to be on. So what seemed like a fortune is, I think it was $100,000. Do you remember what it was? A $100,000
Yes.
deposit, and we got it from the ILGWU.
Yes.
We got $100,000 to pay for the sound system and to make sure that everybody heard. Now, my hereto-mentioned friend John Riley, who was in the Justice Department at that point, claimed to me that he knew where the plug was for that sound system, and if things got bad, he was going to pull the plug. And I said, that would be brilliant. If things got bad, you pull the plug so the leaders couldn't tell people what to do. Are you crazy? I mean, we were arguing this in 1986, so, you know, but anyway, but we were very involved in sound. There was press. There was a big... I will tell you a story that, and I'm sorry to say, that A. Philip Randolph was invited to speak on the march to the National Press Club in Washington. First time a black speaker invited to the National Press Club. Before the march. To explain it, here comes the rub. You know who wasn't allowed into the National Press Club in Washington? Women. So, Randolph is visited by a delegation of Evelyn Cunningham and Norman, help me, some other black women
Doris
reporters.
Height.
What?
Dorothy Height?
May have been Dorothy Height, but they were primarily the women reporters, Ethel Payne,
Yes.
Dorothy Height, and they said, you can't do this. You can't go down there and make a speech. And so for that day, the National Press Club allowed women to sit in the balcony. Get a view of what the times were like. I mean, A. Philip Randolph, when we got to Washington, wanted to have a decent meal. And the restaurant we went to, any of you have been to Washington, it's been closed for a million years, was Blackie's Steakhouse. It was like, I don't know, it was like a silly little steakhouse, but it was an integrated restaurant where you could go to. So anyway, but
mentioned that there was a young man who was, name is Ron Haney. Matter of fact, he's a classmate of Anthony Harmon. And he memorized he's an actor. And he does the I Have a Dream speech from beginning to end. But he just, in another part of that, told me he now does it in Spanish as well. So if anyone needs it as a resource, let me know.
Yes.
Can we share this video, like maybe some of the children
Yes.
would
Yeah,
benefit
right.
from the panel?
What we're going to do is put the video up on the Schenker website, this one and the historian.
this video of this.
Yes.
That's why I didn't want you eating with Chef.
That's why we didn't tell you to now, no.
So I'm sorry. Lily, you mentioned three things to focus on. One was the tolerance issue with the gay issues, right? And then the other one, the labor civil rights thing. And then what was the third?
Malcolm.
Okay.
Yeah,
Did Norman and Velma want to talk about Malcolm in the march?
Malcolm was there that day and stood on the side and was an ongoing critic of the march.
I think you referred to it as the Farce on Washington?
The what?
The Farce on
He
Washington?
stood, as I remember it, he stood in the lobby of the Statler Hilton.
Yes.
And he cornered reporters
Yep.
and talked about the farce in Washington. This is, I don't know, where was Malcolm in his life transformations at that point? Was he still the,
He hadn't been to.
he hadn't been to Nick yet?
No.
I must say, I don't think many people paid attention to him. Do you have a sense that anybody paid attention?
No, not that day.
Oh, what
Not
is
me.
this?
That's okay. Adhim?
Do you know how to shut it off?
No, I don't know how to shut it off. I just got it.
Oh, okay, I'm shutting off your sound,
Oh, okay.
so you can look and see.
I have two questions.
Oh, I know what it is. You know.
Or, I guess observations, questions.
Yeah.
The first, I just wanted to hear, Rachel was talking about the media, and she was talking about some of the positive
Shut up.
parts. But
I'm
I
sorry,
wanted to
I can't
know just the national view of the media, like after, when the day was over.
Yeah, tell me the movie.
I'm sorry, I'm not loud enough.
I only hear in one ear, and she's talking by other
Oh.
ones.
I was saying the media as a whole, what were they saying after it was over? Like, was everyone positive that day? Yeah, I know you spoke about a couple of areas, but
Yeah.
was the media negative, and then as time went on, but what was the national media like the days following?
Well, you know, I don't know too much about what the southern racist media did, right? But the instantaneous response was to I Have a Dream. There's no doubt that they got it. And then there was a certain this was a day that was peaceful. They didn't say we were wrong, but they sort of acknowledged that it was peaceful. The media was the northern mainstream media, that is CBS, NBC, TV, the papers were very positive. I have no idea what they said in Alabama and Birmingham, but if you take a look at what those papers do to Barack Obama today, you can imagine what they did then. I mean, you know, so I think there was a lot of negative stuff. And certainly the black press, the Chicago Defender, the Philadelphia papers, they were as positive as anything could be.
Yeah, there was a lot of international coverage too.
Yeah.
And there were commemorative things that were published. Some of the unions came out with commemorative journals about the march and their participation in it. And of course, Bard and Randolph were on the cover of Life magazine a week, 10 days after
Yeah,
the march.
The interesting thing, which I talked about earlier, about maybe getting you to see, is the United States Information Agency made a film of the march, the day of the march, and I kept on telling them which buses to go on. And it's a very nice film. That is, it shows people leaving for the march. And the USIA distributed it internationally. And the introduction to the film is very interesting because I'm going to get the numbers wrong. But it's also good for a class. They say they rode from Birmingham to Washington, the distance between Paris and Rome. And in this film, they make the international analogy, which is very good for geography. The interesting thing about this film is they didn't get the I Have a Dream speech. They take King, I think they cut too many speeches out. But when they go to Dr. King, they have him, the end of his speech where he says, "Great God Almighty, free at last." And I don't know why they did that, whether they were dumb or they thought it was for that period too inflammatory in the sense that it was projecting. I was trying to figure out why would they miss that, right? So that maybe some bureaucrat thought that that speech portrayed America not in the right light. I have no idea why they did it. I shouldn't really conjure it up, but it's very strange. But the film itself, with the exception of that one little miss, is a very good film and very good geographically and international stuff. And you say it's on the web? You can get it on the internet?
I'm not really sure about that. You could scroll around and see. It was produced by somebody named, I think, David Blue for the USIA, because it was only shown abroad. It wasn't shown in this country at the time. But it's just simply called The March.
Yeah, years after it was produced, somebody snuck me into a USIA office so I could see it. I'm sorry?
It's the
United States Information Agency.
Yeah.
It used to be an entity that the United States government would have around the world to present, American view of. I mean, this is an interesting theme because clearly one of the pieces of leverage that the civil rights movement had was how the rest of the world was viewing what happened in the United States. It was an extraordinarily important, I think, piece of leverage.
Yeah, Leo is absolutely right. When John F. Kennedy was trying to get the Big Six to not call off the march, one of his arguments to them was, "I'm going to be in Europe, and it will be terrible if there are riots in the street while I'm in Europe." A. Philip Randolph had a very good answer. Don't go to Europe. There won't be riots, but don't go to Europe if it bothers you. And the second thing that happened was the Chinese, Mao Zedong, sent a telegram saying, "We support the March on Washington." And that became a moment when you had to think about it because we obviously did not want the march associated with totalitarianism. And I must say, Roy Wilkins quickly dashed off a telegram to Mao Zedong saying, "Thank you very much for your support, and we look forward to the day when we can support a similar march in China."
So I think before we end, I think we need
Yes.
can we sum up what's our next assignment?
And also because there's the new teachers that are in the mix, so.
Yeah, I understand it, and it's a school night, so we don't want to keep people up any later than necessary. So 3 weeks from now, and I will redo all of this by email, so don't feel like you madly have to get all this down. 3 weeks from now, we're going to do the historians panel, also here at the UFT. All right. We have set, the elementary school teachers are new to this. I will send around what we had as an outline for the elements of a lesson plan. You tell me if that works for you or if we need to adjust it for the elementary schools. You should, at the secondary school, teachers that were at the meeting last time started communicating with themselves about what sorts of things they might do. I think you also want to communicate that with each other, and the idea is to have not huge groups, but enough of a group so that you're not in this alone. You have other people to depend upon, and you always have the Schenker Institute to depend upon in this process. So I will send again those of you who haven't gotten the book and the DVD and stuff, we will get that to you. The elementary school teachers indicate to me we will get you copies of the children's book about Bayard and about A. Philip Randolph. I will send to you all of the documents by PDF, because that's the quickest way so that you can do it. There are really a great richness of all of this. And I am thinking that we don't know exactly the entire form of this, but you know that every alternate year the AFT holds a professional educational conference as opposed to a convention, and this summer is such. And I would like to have this group do some things at that conference in terms of developing, you know, our work. So, so just make sure I get that list with everybody's name and email on it. Why don't we end the panel here, okay, with a last reflection from everybody about, as you look back on this now, 50 years ago that this happened, what for you is the meaning of that, and what is the meaning of having been able to participate in this event? What I have to say for me, coming along a little later than you all, but still,
We know you're young, Leo. You made that
still
clear.
substantially earlier than the number of our teachers. But for me, one of the things that is always, you know, that I never lose touch with how much the people who were important to this union and played such a vital role in this union. You know, there was no friend of the UFT that was greater than Bayard Rustin. How central they were to all of these events in a way that I don't think, you know, very many of us truly appreciate. And you know, part of, I think, this is a sense of the kind of heritage that we, as members of this union, that we've received and that we need to pass on. So why don't we, in whatever order that you all would like, do this summation on your sense of the meaning and importance of this looking backwards.
Well, I started off. All right. I really associate the march with two quotes from A. Philip Randolph that are part and parcel of his philosophy of social, political, and economic change, and also part of his militancy. And they go something like this: salvation for a race, nation, or class must come from within. Freedom is never granted, it is won. Justice is never given, it is exacted. Freedom and justice must be struggled for by the oppressed of all lands and races. And the struggle must be continuous, for freedom is never a final fact, but a continually evolving process to higher and higher levels of human, social, economic, political, and religious relationships. And the last quote is, at the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization.
Well, I think a lot of people and a lot of historians think of the March on Washington as the high point of the civil rights movement. And I think, you know, one could certainly make a case for that. I also think that the march really, this was the first of its kind in this country, and I think it, of course, inspired many of the marches that have since taken place. I mean, it really gave people a sense of empowerment and enabled people like the women's movement and the gay rights movement, all kinds of movements, to march on Washington. There's a quote in Brother Outsider, Andy Young is talking about the March on Washington, and he said, you know, Bayard Rustin did this great organizing job, and Martin Luther King put the icing on the cake with the I Have a Dream speech. And I think what's happened over the years is we've really concentrated on the icing a lot, and the cake, which is a lot of what we were talking about earlier, the economics piece, the jobs piece, the integrated schools, the house. Those are the things that we really haven't dealt with. And so I think the legacy of the march is the fact that we still have poverty to deal with. We still have higher minimum wages, all of these things. That was really the cake for Bayard and Randolph, and that's what we really need to focus on, especially this year, if we go back to Washington and continue.
Well, when I look back at the March on Washington, I think of it as, it is true, it really was a turning point. But I'm saddened because today we need that same kind of elan, vitality, impetus, because the problems are still here. And there doesn't seem to be the same kind of leadership that we had in '63. And maybe it will develop, but I get a little sad because what we need to have is a focus on things like the March on Washington and its demands, and the freedom budget and its demands. Let me just say one thing. I think we're all fortunate to have known Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph, people like that. And there is a movement to award Bayard Rustin with the Medal of Freedom. And I just hope that that movement grows to a point where Obama will see fit to really recognize the person who I think, whose shoulders he really stands on, which is Bayard Rustin's. But good luck to you all. I think we're all available if you need us and want to talk to us more. Thank you.
Well, I share everybody's feelings, including George's. From a personal point of view, I think you may have noticed that I'm white, and I think that melanin. But the fact of the matter is that I feel like I was incredibly lucky to have met Bayard when I was 17 and to be able to play a role in a movement which changed history. It's gone forward, it's gone backwards, there are things that have been done, but in fact, history was changed. And I go back now to my grandson, who said to me, I feel terrible. I can't do what you did. And he said, how can I do what you did? Now, and this is a kid, I finally told him that he graduated from college, and the first thing he did was run out in 2008 to Colfax County, New Mexico, and he organized for Obama. And I said, you did something. It was just a much bigger pond. I mean, we were in a small pond. This is a much bigger pond, and it's a different time. And I wish I could figure out how to build a solid, substantial movement for economic justice today. I haven't figured that one out, to tell you the truth.
Yeah.
And when I do, I'll let you all know. But the fact of the matter is, I think that we were all very lucky to have participated in this movement, and history really has blessed us in a certain sense. And I hope that we can somehow impart what George said, the feelings of those days, and certainly as much as we have to go forward, as far as we have come, including, by the way, with the Obama presidency. When I voted, I wore beads that Bayard gave me because I knew he would have wanted to be in that voting booth to vote for it. I have no doubt that he would argue with him on certain policies, sure, but I know exactly how he would have felt about that election.
I have to say, I certainly never thought I would live to vote for a person who became the first African American in the United States presidency. So change is possible. Let me just say, on behalf of everyone here, thank you to all of the members of our panel for being with us tonight and sharing your sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and I think we all feel just a little bit richer for having been here and having been able to participate in it.